So welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring the future and future creators. And for all those that like really great stories, I'm Ira Pastor, your life sciences ambassador along for this journey. So as many of you know, in a recent episode, we delved into the fascinating topic of so-called living architecture and living machines and sort of the principle of evolution as it pertains to the so-called built environment. Today, we are going to continue along this unique line of area of discussion, the life sciences, and segue into the area of living robotics. If you've been paying any attention to scientific literature over the last few weeks, you may have come across the term Xenobot in the press, named partially after the African clawed frog, Xenopus laevis. And these Xenobots are defined in the press as self-healing microbots that are designed and programmed by a computer, also known as an evolutionary algorithm, and built from the ground up using living biologic cells. These Xenobots are biological machines that are under a millimeter wide. They're made of both heart and skin cells derived from stem cells harvested from Xenopus, which, as many folks know, is an extremely important model organism used throughout the developmental biology world. A team composed of scientists from both the University of Vermont and Tufts University recently created these novel living machines, which were capable of doing things like moving towards a target, picking up a payload, healing themselves, sort of like an embryo after being cut. And this all really is really fascinating because it helped increase our understanding not only of how complex tissues and organs potentially are formed in the case of applications like regenerative medicine, but also one day may be able to do such tasks as deliver drugs inside the human body, clean up radioactive waste, collect microplastics from the ocean. The list goes on and on. Today I'm joined by one of the amazing members of the Xenobot team. Dr. Josh Bongard is professor of Morphology, Evolution, and Cognition Laboratory at the Department of Computer Science, the College of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences at the University of Vermont. Dr. Bongard completed his bachelor's in computer science from McMaster University in Canada, his master's in evolutionary and adaptive systems, University of Sussex, PhD in informatics from the University of Zurich, and a postdoc in computational synthesis laboratory at Cornell. One of the amazing, fascinating areas that goes on in Dr. Bongard's lab is this topic of evolutionary robotics. And this evolutionary robotics work, the lab ultimately has a goal of directing the evolution of increasingly complex, capable autonomous machines to perform a wide range of tasks, ultimately asking the question, how can we automatically design a robot with as little human intervention as possible? This work is quite cross-disciplinary. It merges disciplines of theoretical biology, cognitive sciences, computational neuroscience, psychology, philosophy. And Dr. Bongard is also the co-author of several books, including How the Body Shapes the Way We Think, A New View of Intelligence, and is also co-author of Designing Intelligence, Why Brains Aren't Enough. Josh, thanks for taking the time to come on the show today.
My pleasure, Ira. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Typically, we start off the show by giving our guests the floor just to talk for a few minutes about themselves, just a little bit about who you are, your background, how you got interested in computer sciences, and ultimately sort of what led you to this really interesting epicenter that merges biology and computational science.
Sure. So again, thanks again for having me on. And you listed some of the schools I attended towards the latter half of my career. But when I was younger, like many people growing up in the 80s when personal computers were first coming out, we were very excited about this new technology. But I got interested about why computers were starting to appear in our homes, but not robots. So sci-fi promised human-level robots, commander data anytime soon.
Sure.
So that's sort of what led me on my journey, which was, what is the difference between computers and robots, and why, in retrospect, now in the 2020s, have we made such progress in creating powerful computers, but we are still struggling with creating robots that can work and act and play alongside us in the real world. And the difference between those two technologies is what sort of drives a lot of the work we do in my group, and now the work on Xenobots with Professor Levin's group at Tufts.
Outstanding. As part of your sort of your program, I mean, one of the areas, well, there are actually two areas here that you work with. One, which are evolutionary algorithms, which are sort of defined as sort of these machine intelligence, artificial intelligence programs that are inspired by evolution, in terms of reproduction, mutation, recombination. And then you also, there's the term, and I apologize, I'm skewing some of this artificial ontogeny, where you can basically use some of these tools to, in essence, take that egg or what have you, and sort of move it through a variety of these tasks in the virtual environment. Can you talk in general about this dynamic, sort of what is involved in these two disciplines, and then ultimately sort of how you merge these computer tools with sort of the biologic side? Because I know in this current work, sort of you study the biologic environment, but you also feed information into the computer and vice versa. So can you just lead us to a little bit of that, just to understand sort of what you did to accomplish these tasks?
Sure. Yeah, I think you raise a good point. So a lot of my work, it borrows from biology and tries to give back to biology. So computer science and biology are very tightly integrated in the kind of work that my group does. So it's hard to sometimes see where the biology ends and the AI or the computer science and robotics starts. So the basic way that we think about this is, as a society, we can go about trying to build machines in a hands-on way, which in the case of robotics is we sit down and we come up with an idea for the shell of the machine. We're going to build a humanoid robot or a dog robot or a drone or an autonomous car, and try and program intelligence into that machine. We've made some progress on that, and we're making a fair bit of progress recently. The evolutionary spin on this is, of course, that's not what happened in nature. Mother Nature did not stumble on the human body plan and then build brains into us over time. She started with very, very simple machines, unicellular organisms, all the way up to us and other complex creatures. So in an evolutionary algorithm, which you mentioned, this is a computer program that mimics evolution, creates a population of robots in our case, and some of them are pretty simple. And it does this trial and error process. It creates both the body plan and the controller of the robot simultaneously. Sure. So the evolutionary algorithm is sculpting bodies and brains together. And in past work, we've used that to design soft robots made out of soft materials like silicone and plastic and ceramics and electronics. And then more recently, we used it to design the Xenobots, and we can talk more about that in a moment if you like.
Sure.
Then you mentioned this related algorithm called artificial ontogeny. And ontogeny is the biological term for growth. So artificial ontogeny follows along in this progression of us as human designers trying to be more and more hands-off. So the idea here is, instead of evolving robots or machines, the evolutionary algorithm evolves a growth process, and that growth process influences a growing machine. So the idea, again, in nature, Mother Nature, for example, doesn't tinker with eye color in humans. She tinkers with the growth process that eventually results in green eyes or brown eyes or blue eyes. Okay. So evolution itself is very indirect. It doesn't evolve blueprints. It evolves recipes, how to mix things together to produce some desired end result. That's the idea of artificial ontogeny. It's known as evolution of development, or evo-devo in biology, if that's familiar to some of your listeners. So we borrow that idea and build that into our evolutionary algorithm for the reason that we would also like to be hands-off. We would like the computer, in the form of the evolutionary algorithm, to figure out how to guide a simple machine into becoming a more complex and more capable machines. And we are trying out that idea with the Xenobots.
Outstanding. Along those lines, you talk about sort of the recipes, and one of the things that obviously is a wonderful example of that is complex form when it comes to the shape and structure of these complex components that we're made up, you and I and everyone listening, whether it's a heart or a spinal cord or a brain. We find that unlike a certain protein that a gene can code for, there's no formula sitting somewhere in the genome that says, this is how you make, how you put this heart together.
Exactly.
There are cells. As Mike Levin, who was one of your partners on this project, he's very big into the membrane potentials and the bioelectric dimension. There's forces of mechanotransduction. There's all sorts of different things going on. Talk about, if you would, what goes on in terms of the and I sort of looking at some of the materials. It looks like the computer sort of tests out, or you're involved in testing out like many different combinations of what the Xenobot could happen to it along its path. What types of things does the system learn or access in terms of these different recipes, so that at the end number 5,243 is the perfect recipe that we can then learn from?
Sure. So maybe answering your question in the reverse order. So number 5,243 is the best design. So what do we mean by the best design? So for us, the best design is obviously the design that is offered up by the evolutionary algorithm. From its point of view, this is the thing that is most likely to work. But this evolutionary algorithm is running on a supercomputer, and it is doing this trial and error evolutionary process with simulated xenobots. They exist in a virtual petri dish. So obviously, if it's going to try out lots and lots of designs, it needs to do it quickly. We do it all in simulation. So the evolutionary algorithm is offering up the best simulated xenobot. And we then transfer that to our colleagues at Tufts. And in this case, our microsurgeon colleague, Doug Blackiston, then builds, according to this recipe, builds that physical xenobot. And the heart of our paper that we published in January showed that the physical xenobot would, in some cases, do in the physical petri dish what the computer predicted it would do from the virtual petri dish. So this is known in robotics as crossing the reality gap. The AI comes up with a machine in simulation, we build it, and we see whether it was right, so to speak. So the amazing thing to us and to others now who read the paper is that this is possible. So that's the best design. But getting back to maybe the heart of your question is, how does the computer know that this particular design is going to work well in reality? And so that major challenge for my group, which was responsible for the computational side, which is, how do you model a developing frog embryo that is not going to develop into a frog embryo? It's going to develop into something else, and that's what the computer is doing, is trying to guess, if you put together heart and skin cells in this way, this is what you'll get. And it's challenging because, again, Mike's group has learned a lot about how cells communicate bioelectrically and otherwise, but there are also big missing pieces to that puzzle. So it's like asking a computer to design a new kind of airplane where we don't know much about steel or jet propulsion. You can imagine it's a very difficult thing to do because there's a lot of uncertainty. So what we tried to do was to challenge the AI to design something that's predictable, even if the design itself is made up of unpredictable parts. So in the case of the Xenobots, I can give you a specific example. We were using heart cells, and obviously if heart cells assemble into an adult frog heart, they will synchronize and beat as one as they're supposed to. But it's not clear how or whether they will synchronize if you put those heart cells together in a different combination, which is what the AI is doing. So we told the AI, assume that they will just act independently. They will beat at their own frequency. They won't necessarily synchronize. You're going to have to deal with unreliable parts, but the simulated Xenobot still has to move in a straight line. The global behavior of the individual Xenobot has to be reliable. So one metaphor for thinking about this is if you had a whole bunch of human rowers and they're all rowing at their own frequency and they don't pay attention to what anyone else in the boat is doing, design the shape of a boat so that when you put these rowers in the boat will go straight. For most humans, that is a seemingly impossible puzzle to solve. But one of the cool things for us, one of the surprising things, is that an AI can solve that problem. It can build a reliable machine out of unreliable parts.
what are, obviously, the press, talks about the far future in terms of, cleaning up the oceans, detoxifying radioactive waste. Obviously, early days in the Xenobot world, but clearly this is really transformational stuff. What are some of the things that you envision? Obviously, at the very beginning, you're going to be you're going to be learning more about form and complex structure, but at the same time, clearly you're thinking of all the possibilities 10, 20, and so forth years out. What are some of the science fiction type stuff that you're thinking about as you do the fundamental work?
Sure. Yeah. Of course, it's fun to think about. You mentioned, actually, we mentioned in the paper, environmental remediation, cleaning up microplastics and contaminants. And again, it's hard to know where this basic science may go. The reason we suggested those applications as possible applications is because the Xenobots are 100% biodegradable and biocompatible. So cleaning up the oceans at the moment, it's difficult to see how we might do that with traditional machines because they're made of metals and plastics. And as those machines break down, they're contributing to the problem they're trying to solve. So from a simple point of view, that might be the case. But of course, we wouldn't want to do that anytime soon because releasing large amounts of Xenobots, of which we don't understand all the repercussions, would be maybe not a good thing to do. So what we'd like to do for now, before we move on to applications, is to actually use the Xenobots not as an engineering tool, not as something to clean up the oceans or remove plaque from human arteries, is to design Xenobots that help us understand biology better. So as you mentioned, we're trying to learn, Mike's group and other biology groups are trying to understand how cells talk to one another, and in general, how to make machines that communicate, that have relatively simple rules. And when you put them together, you get some desired global result. And at the same time, you can ensure that you do not get negative global results, like Xenobots reproducing out of control, or all the scenarios we've seen in every Hollywood movie. So, but it's difficult to understand what happens when you put cells together because we can only study existing organisms at the moment, and those organisms have offered up some secrets of Mother Nature, but other ones are harder to get at because you end up killing the organism at the same time as you're trying to understand what's going on, or you can't see what's going on inside the organism. So the Xenobots, one of the things that's most interesting to me, and I guess you could consider this an application, is the Xenobots are a new scientific instrument. They could act like a telescope or a microscope. The AI might be able to design Xenobots that advertise their internal workings better than any organisms we currently know of. So sort of step one is, can we do this basic science, use them to better understand how local rules give rise to global behavior? And if they do help us understand that process better, then we could start to move on to applications where we're going to let these things loose in the environment, armed with a better understanding of what may go wrong if we do so. That's sort of the plan at the moment. You mentioned, sort of far future applications. Obviously, life has demonstrated its ability to fill pretty much every ecological niche on Earth. If we want to deploy machines for the inside of human bodies, deep underground, the open ocean, maybe space, who knows? Maybe Xenobots themselves can't do this, but there may be combinations of artificial materials like metals, ceramics, and electronics combined with biological material. And can we figure out how to put those two technologies together so that they complement one another? They bring together the best of both worlds, and they cancel out the drawbacks of the other technology. I think that idea of biohybrid machines is being pursued by lots of other labs at Harvard and MIT and other groups. And I think that's really exciting. If we want to try and move on to very far future applications, colonizing space, extending lifespan, all the big picture things, it's going to require machines that combine artificial and biological materials.
you rattled something in my brain there for a moment, because a couple months ago, I had Dr. Penny Boston on the show, who's leading, has led NASA's astrobiology group for the last couple decades.
Yeah.
And she goes, climbing around caves and stuff, looking for all the weird extremophiles that could potentially survive out there.
Right.
Clearly you're working with components of embryo or Xenopus embryos, but yet, microorganisms also have some of these. Even though they're microorganisms, they're different groups that also agglomerate and hang out together and form interesting structures. Are there possibilities to combine different species in creating Xenobots as well, as opposed to sort of inert materials?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We're straying outside my area of expertise.
All right, it was just one of those Hollywood ideas.
Well, who knows? There are obviously endosymbionts. I mean, obviously,
Sure.
we are hosts for untold numbers of small little critters in our gut, the microbiome. We are already examples that symbionts are possible.
Sure.
So why not? At the macro scale, obviously, we're very large animals, so that seems odd to us, but why not?
Yeah.
You mentioned extremophiles, and again, if we want to develop machines that can enter and deal with extreme environments, being small is an advantage, right?
Absolutely.
So you could imagine trying to make Xenobots as small as possible in order to resist the extremes of extreme environments. One of the things we're looking at, though, is Xenobots that collaborate. We actually showed some of that in our current paper. So might it not be worthwhile to make machines that are individually very small machines, and they come together to form a larger machine when they need to, and vice versa? And again, this idea of swarms has been explored in science fiction for a long time.
Right.
But one of the things I find interesting about the Xenobots is they might provide us a shortcut to realizing machine swarms.
In creating these initial Xenobots, I mentioned that you took the embryonic stem cells, you created heart and skin tissue. Obviously, no neurons at this stage, but this brings up obviously a very fascinating topic, one that you write about in your books, one that I know Mike Levin has published on as well, I think maybe together, and basically sort of the concept of non-neural memories, or the fact that I took a quote from your book, sort of the kinds of thoughts we're capable of have their foundation in our embodiment, in our morphology and the material property of our bodies. Sort of, there's a lot more sort of, let's say, cognition, and I'm speaking out of my zone here, going on throughout our complex biology. What can we learn, and what maybe do you hope to learn in terms of the non-neural cognition component of Xenobots, and maybe what we can learn from that, in the sense that, we know we have species on the planet that don't have brains. We know that we don't have a brain for several weeks when we're an embryo, and so forth. What types of interesting things do you hope to learn from that side of your expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is something I've been interested in for a long time, and so has Mike. Is this idea of embodied cognition? It's actually an old idea that comes from psychology and philosophy, and for a lot of people, it feels like, especially as you get older, that the body is an obstruction. It's getting in the way of what you want to do. And again, this is an idea that goes all the way back to Rene Descartes, and you can find it it's got its roots in Western thought going back centuries.
Yep.
But as we learn more, again, from biology, that the body is an enabler. Basically, organisms and increasingly machines use their bodies to push against the world, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, and observe how the world pushes back. And that action and reaction cycle through the environment provides the raw material that organisms and machines use to learn to exhibit increasingly complex and capable behavior. As you mentioned, organisms have been doing this for a long time without the benefit of nervous systems. Mike likes to say that, nervous systems are kind of a very recent invention.
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of basically a twist or an improvement on adaptive behavior. They are not the full story. So one of the interesting things about Xenobots is, again, being able to understand that better. If we want to really understand what intelligence is, we can obviously study humans and other organisms we consider intelligence. But if we can, through this process, create increasingly unorthodox organisms that are not anything like anything we see on Earth, we're sort of broadening the range of systems that we can look at and try and identify what is common across all these organisms. So instead of studying intelligence as it is, we could study intelligence as it could be. How does intelligence tend to evolve given the opportunity to do so? And again, this relates back to what you were mentioning about life on other worlds, or, this is part of what we're trying to do, is to understand what life and what intelligence is capable of in all its forms.
Awesome. Made it completely fascinating. It's really some of the coolest stuff I've come across. Just, I know we're coming up against the hard stop. You have other things to do. I just wanted to ask one more question of you while I have you, and it basically has to do with coming back to you and your career so far. Obviously, you've worked with a variety of very interesting folks in the science community. Are there any influencers throughout your development to date, your path, that have really guided you, that you may want to give a shout out to, that, if it wasn't for these particular people, that Dr. Josh Bongard would be doing law or something totally different, people that really kept you on this path and have influenced you to date?
We could spend the next 2 hours with me rattling off names. I will mention just a few. Philip Husbands, Inman Harvey at the University of Sussex in the UK, my PhD advisor, Rolf Pfeiffer, my postdoc advisor, Hod Lipson, Mike Levin, Daniel Dennett. You can look up these names, and they've all been direct or indirect influences on me. And one of the things that I took away from them and how they approach science is this emphasis on interdisciplinary work. The big questions that we're interested in are not going to be answered just in philosophy, just in AI, just in computer science, just in biology. And I hope that the Xenobots are just the latest example of what's possible when you bring together, in this case, biology and computer science. I think for your younger listeners who are working their way up the ladder and trying to get into academia and wondering about what to work on or what degree to take, my advice is to try and find, people and groups that are working at the interface between the disciplines. That's what I tried to do, and the people that I mentioned helped me along the way. That's where the really cool stuff is happening, and I think that's where some of the answers to our big questions are going to come from.
Outstanding. This theme of convergence, which is so extremely important nowadays.
Absolutely.
So, Josh, this has been really, really eye-opening. I know you have so much you're doing, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show today. And as we say on the show, moving the human story forward, moving the Xeno story forward, and I'm really wishing you the best in continuing this research. I'm really going to keep an eye on it as it moves forward. And for everybody that's going to be watching the show on the YouTube channel and listening on the various podcast networks, we've been speaking with Dr. Josh Bongard, Professor of Morphology, Evolution Cognition Laboratory at University of Vermont, doing truly amazing things in the world of computer science, development of biology, and Xenobots, and keep an eye on everything that he's doing, and his cross-disciplinary team of collaborators, because it really is cutting edge stuff and really exciting for our future. So Josh, thanks so much for the time today.
My pleasure, Ira. Thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely.